My mother's name was Doris Emily Chan. She was born on August 22, 1921, in Victoria, British Columbia. My mother's story begins when my great-great-grandfather, Doris Lee Sr., arrived in San Francisco from Canton, China in the 1850s during the gold rush. He opens and operates a merchandise and grocery store, and he would send supplies to Stockton and Sacramento. His son, Doris Lee Jr., arrives from China at the age of 14 to work alongside his father, but of the few employment options available to the Chinese, discovers that his interest is in gardening. He applies and is hired at the newly opened Hotel Del Monte in Monterey, California, in 1880. He was an extremely hard worker and talented gardener and was promoted to foreman in charge of the gardeners. Robert Elric was a superintendent of the 2,000-acre estate, and Doris Lee was his right-hand man. Doris Lee was paid $40 per month and was provided with a cottage on the hotel grounds. The cottage had running water, a wood stove, and they used coal lamps at night. In 1888, at the age of 25, Doris Lee returns to Canton to wed and brings back his bride, who is 16 years old. The Lees had 10 children. 7 survived. The first was born in 1894, my grandmother. There are no records of the limitations or quality of life imposed on the parents, but in a 1962 article for a San Francisco magazine, my great-aunt Agnes was interviewed. She described an idyllic life as a child. They attended Oak Grove School. The children played baseball with neighborhood children, most of British descent. This photo, as well as the previous 2, were taken by Mr. Johnston, the hotel's house photographer. Unbeknownst to the family, this image was made into a postcard and was sold in San Francisco. It is still for sale to this day. According to Agnes, the children were free to roam inside the hotel and on the hotel grounds. They were welcome to play in the maze, as well as swim in the pools. Their towels and swimsuits were loaned by the hotel at no charge. In 1906, at the age of 34, Mrs. Lee dies. Doris Lee arranges for himself and 6 of his 7 children to go to his village in Canton to be cared for by his mother. They range in age from 18 months to 10 years old. The trip would take just over a month and a half, first by steamship to Hong Kong and then train to Canton and on to the village 4 miles inland. The family are carried by sedan chairs to the village. Doris Lee would return immediately to his job at the hotel. The children would remain in China until 1918. Doris Lee would continue to excel at his job at the hotel. By the time the children return, he would be making $80 a month. While her siblings had been in China, my grandmother May cared for her father and visits friends in Watsonville. She had met and fell in love with a young teenager named John Lee. However, in 1911, and 1 month after her 17th birthday, my grandmother is sent to Victoria, BC to marry John Chan, who is 36 years old, in an arranged marriage. John had emigrated to Victoria in 1902 at the age of 27. He has built a successful lumber and wood dealership in Victoria. May proves to be a talented dressmaker, a talent that she said was a gift from God. She starts her own dressmaking business called Pandora Dressmakers at 739 Pandora Street in Victoria. In 1912, May and John had their first of 8 children. In total, the family would have 2 boys and 6 girls. My mother Doris was the 4th of 8 children. In 1916, my grandparents purchased 2003 Quadra Street. Family stories say that they were the first Chinese to buy and live outside of Chinatown. My grandfather would buy treed lots. He would clear the land, sell the wood, and throw the deed in a drawer in his desk. Over time, it was said in the family that he owned half of downtown Victoria. I have not been able to verify this information. The oldest, my Uncle Ed, went to work with his father, handling the business side while his father managed the operations. In 1942, John Chan dies. It is at his death that it is discovered that Ed has secretly changed the ownership of the business from his father to himself, effectively stealing everything but the Quadra Street house from his mother. Although my grandfather had built a successful business, he did not know how to read or write English, and trusting his son, signed whatever his son asked him to. In 1944, my grandmother decides to leave Victoria with her 3 youngest children, all under the age of 18, and return to California to marry her first true love. My mother, Doris, was born in 1921. According to my mother, her mother was an incredibly loving and warm woman. She was also very encouraging of her daughters to pursue their interests. Her mother, and subsequently mine, would say that sons were fine, but daughters would be with you for the rest of your life. This is a photo of Doris's Chinese Immigration Act registration papers. The act was passed by the Canadian government in 1923 to reduce the number of Chinese immigrating to Canada. It was highly successful, resulting in only 15 Chinese coming to Canada between the years 1923 and 1946. My grandparents had become part of Chinese high society. This is a group wedding photo for the prominent Lu Poi family. Doris is a flower girl at age 7. Doris kept a diary her entire life. She kept everything else, too. Cards, letters, photos, every keepsake you could imagine. Doris went to school at George J. Elementary. There were few Asians apart from her siblings. She then goes to Victoria High. She also attends Chinese school in the afternoons at the Chinese Presbyterian Church. In 1940, she graduates from high school. From a very young age, Doris loved to draw. She would make little paper books and sketch people and fashion. Doris loved fashion. So her family and friends were not surprised when Doris decided to write her university entrance exams, then applied and was accepted to the Institute of Fashion Design in San Francisco, California. From the age of 13, Doris and her sisters worked alongside their mother, first part-time and then as full-time dressmakers. Doris remembers getting 25 cents a hem and diligently saving her money. Growing up with 6 daughters, all close in age, the Quadra Street home was a revolving door of friends and suitors alike. It became a hub of social activity. They had a large rec room complete with a bar. The Chan girls were known for their parties, big band music, and jitterbugging the night away. Doris loved movies. From her early teens, she would bring her sketch pad and see the latest fashions on the silver screen. Doris would draw the outfits, and then her mother would trace the pattern out on the material with her thumbnail. Then Doris and her sisters would make them. When Doris returned from San Francisco, she took her place alongside her sisters and mother at Pandora's Dressmakers. Each daughter had their specialty. For Doris, it was wedding dresses and evening gowns. Doris and her sisters made all of their own clothes and were able to recreate all the latest fashions. The clothes Doris and her sisters wear in this slideshow are examples of their talent. Their customers are the politicians' wives of Parliament and the Victoria elite. After their mother moved to California, Doris and her sisters, Rose, Mabel, and Myrtle, continue to operate the dressmaking business. Doris is a single, financially independent young woman in her 20s. Her life is filled with friends, fun, dances, dates, parties, and more parties. She lives life to the fullest. Another one of Doris's loves is travel. She would take frequent trips to the United States. And on one visit, she worked as an extra in the war film, God is My Co-Pilot. Doris was also never short of potential suitors and dates. In her diaries, she would write about various boys stopping by the house, or calling for a date and juggling her various social activities. Nightclubs were popular in the 1940s, where the photographer would come by to take a picture of your table. In my mother's papers, she has dozens of these photos from clubs that catered to the Chinese community. With the war years, a number of the local Victoria boys had volunteered to serve with the British Army. A top-secret unit called Force 136 was formed with the intention of the Chinese boys infiltrating the Japanese behind enemy lines in Burma. Doris corresponded with friends and suitors who were serving overseas. This letter is from Dick Yip, who Doris dated. In it he writes, "We Chinese boys were interviewed by a British Army major and his proposition for a trip to India. Dick accepted." By the age of 25, Doris had purchased a car with her sister and had $5,000 in the bank. Doris started investing her money at the age of 22. It was wartime, so she invested in war bonds and whole life annuities that paid dividends. She continued investing all through her life, adding stocks and bonds. And in later years, when each of her children were born, she would buy a 20-year whole life policy in our name. When we turned 20, she gave us our policies. By age 27, she bought her first house at 1781 Bay Street in Victoria. The price was $8,000, and Doris put $5,000 down and had a $3,000 mortgage. A year later, she would purchase the empty lot next door as an investment. The year was 1948. This was also the year that her mother would pass away from complications from hepatitis. She was 54. In my grandmother's will, she stated, "The Quadra Street house would be split evenly among all of my children except Ed, who got more than his share." She also stipulated that the house could not be sold as long as any one of her children wanted to live there. My Aunt Rose lived there until her death. The house was sold in 2005. At 28, she was reintroduced to my father, Ronald Lee, at a dance in Vancouver. Ron was a very handsome and charming young man who'd served in Force 136 alongside Dick Yip and the others from Victoria. She fell head over heels in love. They married in June 1950 and moved into the house on Bay Street. My father had started a meatpacking business with some of his war buddies. The first few years were wonderful. My mother continued working with her sisters while my father grew his business. My parents had their first child, Greg, in 1952. Blake would follow soon after in 54, and then Rhonda in 55, and me in 1958. Those early years were spent socializing with family and friends. In 1957, my dad's sister asked him to come to Vancouver to help her with the grocery store. She was losing money and couldn't figure out why. My father went and determined that the problem was that she was selling inferior goods and decided to go into the grocery business himself. He came back from Vancouver and informed my mother that he had bought a grocery store, sold his share of the meatpacking business, and the family was moving to Vancouver. My mother was devastated. But as wives did, she packed up her 4 children, including me, who was 6 weeks old at the time, rented out her beautiful Bay Street house, said goodbye to her sisters, and moved into a 3-room wood shack tacked onto the back of Columbia Market, a corner grocery store at Broadway and Columbia. Of all of my mother's keepsakes, there were two glaring things missing: wedding photos and photos of the store. We are quite sure at some point she destroyed her wedding photos, and she probably never took a photo of that store. Because unbeknownst to my mother, my father had also started an affair with the younger sister of one of his army buddies. So while my mother worked in the store 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, each weekend my father would go to Victoria to stay with his new love. My mother managed the books, and her first entry is May 1958. She had just given birth to me. The living quarters at the back of the store was one big room divided by a partial wall that separated the two bedrooms. The washer and dryer were next to the only sink in the one room that served as kitchen, dining room, and living room for 8 of us, as my mother had 2 more kids until the doctor would allow my father to get a vasectomy. Growing up, even though we were poor, all 6 of us felt absolutely spoiled by our mom. Over time, my father was around less and less, so it was our mother who raised us. After a while, my dad took a job outside of the store, and then a second one. He gave one check to my mom, and the other he used for himself. Each Friday, my dad was on the ferry to Victoria, not even bothering to come home. Meanwhile, my mom ran the store, took us to the movies, shared her love of music and books, and made every holiday a special occasion. One Sunday night, while watching the Ed Sullivan Show, I saw Chet Atkins playing the Bumblebee song on the guitar, and casually mentioned that I wanted to learn how to do that. The next day I came home from school, and a guitar was sitting on the kitchen table in a cardboard box from Acme Novelty. My mom said I had a guitar lesson starting in a half an hour up the street. With the 3-room shack, she wasn't able to accommodate guests. In this photo, my mom's Aunt Lily came for a visit from San Francisco with Ed's widow, Aunt Eileen, from Victoria. When they left, my mom cried. My mom said that the store only made enough money to feed us 6 kids, but somehow, along the way, without my dad's knowledge, she saved enough money to buy her second home. We moved there when I was 12 in 1970. My mom continued to commute by bus to the store each day until, in 1972, it burnt down. A result of a chemical fire started in the paint store next door. We were extremely fortunate not to have been asleep in the back of the store, as the old wooden building burnt to the ground in minutes. My mom took a job at Mingwo Cookware in Chinatown, where she worked until her retirement at the age of 63. Well, in truth, she didn't really retire, as she became my daughter Mallory's caregiver when I went back to work in 1985. Whenever she could, our mom would pack us all up and take the ferry to Victoria to be with her sisters, who were still extremely close. This was every summer and holiday. After the store burnt down, it was easier for her to get away. During one of her ferry trips with us 6 kids, an old man sitting by himself said, "All yours?" Mom said yes, and the old man replied, "Well, you'll never be lonely." In the 80s, she started to travel around the world. After 40 years, Doris was finally able to resume one of her passions. When my mother passed away at the age of 78 in 1999, after a 2-year battle with kidney failure, at her celebration of life, we said that our mom was the center of our world. She was both our mother and father. My brother Greg said, "For those who have never met my mom, you would know her if you knew any of us, because we are who we are because of our mother." In her will, as her mother had done, she left her house to her kids, stating, "As long as any of my children want to live in the house, it cannot be sold." This was her way, as her mother's, to ensure that her children would always have a home. My 2 youngest sisters continued to live in the Dumfries Street house, as well as my dad, who at the age of 89 found himself homeless after his original longtime love died, and her nieces and nephews, who had inherited all of her estate, kicked him out of their home. Looking back through the photos of my mother's life in Victoria, they capture the fun, carefree days of youth. I know that she had to carry her immigration papers with her from 1924 through to 1946, when the Chinese Immigration Act was finally repealed, and then through the war years to prove she was Chinese, not Japanese. She told us that crossing the border into the U.S. could take most of the day, but she never focused on that. Instead, she made the most of what she had, in any circumstance. She worked hard to earn money. She ran her own businesses. She bought real estate and experienced as much as life could offer and more, being a young, single Chinese-Canadian woman in her 20s in the 1940s. Throughout my mother's life, she lived each day with style, dignity, and grace. She never complained or even reminisced about her long-lost past. Instead, she lived with forthright determination and lived by example, first for herself, and then for her children, and then her grandchildren. Years later, she said that she was able to endure all those years with our dad because she had lived such a full life prior to marriage. Her advice to the younger generation: don't marry young, live first. My mother raised 2 sons who became amazing husbands and fathers. She also raised her daughters to be strong, independent women, who raised strong, independent women. I am so proud to be my mother's daughter, and while making this presentation, I felt she had come for a visit to walk me through her life. She was and will remain a truly exceptional woman. Thank you to my cousin, Dr. Joanne Lee, Department of Gender Studies at the University of Victoria, for encouraging me to create this presentation and for convincing me that my mother's story was important enough to share.